Give that back. He's freezing. The words cut through the cold December air just as a burst of laughter echoed across the sidewalk. 12-year-old Elijah Brooks stood beside a weathered city bench, his worn sneakers planted firmly on the salt-stained pavement. Snow from the previous night still clung to the curbs in uneven piles, gray at the edges from traffic and slush. Across from him, Tyler Dawson grinned as he held up a faded wool blanket that clearly did not belong to him. Around Tyler, several teenagers laughed as if they were watching the funniest thing in the world. But Elijah wasn't looking at them. His eyes stayed fixed on the elderly man sitting on the bench. The man's shoulders trembled beneath a thin jacket that was nowhere near enough for a 28-degree morning. His hands were red from the cold. His beard carried flecks of snow. Yet he sat quietly, saying nothing. Elijah stepped closer. "Please," he said. "Just give it back." Tyler smirked. "Why do you care so much?" Another boy chuckled. "Because he thinks he's everybody's hero." More laughter followed. Elijah felt heat rising in his face despite the freezing wind. He knew these moments. He knew what happened when people decided kindness was something to make fun of. It wasn't the first time. It probably wouldn't be the last. But every time he saw someone hurting, something inside him refused to look away. The old man lowered his eyes toward the sidewalk. That somehow hurt more than the laughter. Elijah glanced at the blanket. It was thin, frayed along the edges, probably worth less than $20. Yet at that moment it might as well have been gold. Because without it, the old man looked smaller, colder, invisible. Tyler finally tossed the blanket onto the snowy ground beside the bench. "There," he said. "Go save him." The group laughed again. Elijah didn't answer. He simply bent down, picked up the blanket, brushed away the snow, and carefully draped it over the old man's shoulders. The man looked up, surprise flickering across his tired face. "Thank you, son," he whispered. Elijah offered a small smile. "You're welcome, sir." The old man nodded slowly. His eyes glistened for a second before he looked away. Behind Elijah, the laughter continued. Someone pulled out a phone. Someone else recorded. "Look at him," a voice called out, "giving away his whole life to strangers." Another voice added, "Maybe he should worry about himself first." Elijah heard every word. He just didn't respond. The truth was, they weren't entirely wrong about one thing. He didn't have much himself. His coat had belonged to his cousin years ago. The zipper only worked halfway. His backpack had been repaired with duct tape 3 different times. Back home, his grandmother was stretching every dollar she could to keep the lights on through winter. But kindness had never felt like something you did only when you had extra. To Elijah, it was something you chose when nobody else would. A cold gust swept through the street, carrying the scent of exhaust and snow. Traffic crawled past the intersection. Most drivers never looked toward the bench. Most never noticed the old man. Most never noticed Elijah either. But one person did. Across the street, parked beside the curb, a black SUV sat quietly beneath the shadow of a downtown office building. The tinted rear window revealed nothing. No one on the sidewalk paid attention to it. No one noticed the man sitting inside. His expensive watch reflected the pale winter sunlight as he watched the entire scene unfold without saying a word. And as Elijah carefully adjusted the blanket around the old man's shoulders, the billionaire in the back seat leaned forward slightly, unable to take his eyes off the boy. The black SUV remained parked for another minute before slowly pulling away from the curb and disappearing into the flow of downtown traffic. Elijah never noticed. He was too busy helping the old man secure the blanket against the wind. The city moved around them in a constant rhythm of honking horns, distant sirens, and hurried footsteps. People passed by carrying coffee cups, briefcases, and shopping bags. Most glanced at the bench for a second and then continued on with their day. The old man offered a grateful smile. "You always stop to help people, do you not?" Elijah shrugged. "I just do what I can." The man studied him quietly. "That is rarer than you think." Elijah smiled politely, but he did not know how to answer. He checked the old man one last time before adjusting the straps on his backpack. "I have to get to school, sir." "Thank you again, son." Elijah nodded and headed toward the bus stop. Cold air rushed through the streets between the tall buildings. His fingers were stiff inside his thin gloves. Snow crunched beneath his sneakers as he walked. By the time he reached the bus, his cheeks burned from the cold. The ride across town took nearly 30 minutes. Elijah sat near the back and stared out the window. The city slowly changed from polished office towers to aging apartment buildings and narrow streets lined with small businesses. When he finally stepped off the bus after school that afternoon, the sun was already beginning to sink lower in the sky. Winter days never seemed long enough. He walked 4 blocks before reaching the apartment building he called home. The brick structure looked tired. Paint peeled from the railings. Several windows were covered with plastic sheets to keep out drafts. Elijah climbed 3 flights of stairs and unlocked apartment 3B. The smell of vegetable soup greeted him immediately. "Grandma," he called. "In the kitchen, baby," came the familiar answer. Elijah smiled. He dropped his backpack beside the couch and walked into the tiny kitchen. Margaret Brooks stood beside the stove stirring a pot with slow, careful movements. At 72 years old, she moved more cautiously than she used to. Her silver hair was tied back neatly, and reading glasses rested low on her nose. "How was school?" she asked. "It was okay." She looked over her shoulder. "Just okay." Elijah grinned. "Maybe a little boring." That earned a soft laugh. "Well, boring is better than trouble." Elijah took 2 bowls from the cabinet and helped set the table. It was a routine they had shared for years. The apartment was small, but it felt warm. Not because of the old radiator that rattled against the wall, because it was home. During dinner, Margaret noticed him rubbing his hands together beneath the table. "Your gloves are getting thin again." Elijah immediately shook his head. "They are fine." "Elijah." He lowered his eyes toward his soup. "They still work." She smiled gently. "You always say that." He changed the subject before she could continue. After dinner, Elijah completed his homework at the kitchen table while Margaret folded laundry nearby. Outside, darkness settled over the city. Snowflakes drifted past the window beneath the orange glow of a street lamp. Everything felt ordinary, quiet, predictable. Yet several miles away, high above the city on the top floor of a glass skyscraper, Richard Whitmore stood beside a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the skyline. The billionaire rarely thought about strangers. He certainly did not spend his evenings thinking about children he passed on the street. But tonight was different. He set a leather folder on his desk and stared out at the city lights below. Then he pressed a button on his phone. "Daniel," he said calmly, "I need you to find someone for me." A pause followed. "A child?" his assistant asked. Richard glanced toward the darkening horizon. "Yes," he replied. "A boy named Elijah Brooks." By the next morning, fresh snow covered the sidewalks like a clean white blanket. The city looked quieter, softer, almost peaceful. Elijah left the apartment before sunrise, carefully pulling his old coat tight around his chest. The hallway smelled faintly of paint and radiator heat as he descended the stairs. Before leaving, he glanced back toward the apartment door. He could hear his grandmother moving around inside, preparing for another day. That small sound always reassured him. Outside, the cold air immediately stung his face. His breath formed pale clouds as he started the familiar walk toward school. Halfway there, he spotted someone sitting near the entrance of a closed pharmacy. It was not the elderly veteran from the day before. This was a different man, younger but clearly struggling. A paper cup rested beside him on the sidewalk. Most people hurried past without looking. Elijah slowed. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the apple he had packed for lunch. For a moment he hesitated. It was the only snack he had until dinner. Then he walked over and placed it gently beside the man. "Good morning, sir," he said. The man's tired eyes widened slightly. "For me?" Elijah nodded. "I hope it helps." A small smile appeared on the man's face. "Thank you." Elijah returned the smile and continued toward school. He never noticed the dark sedan parked across the street. Inside, Daniel Mercer lowered a camera. Richard Whitmore's assistant had spent most of the morning following a simple instruction: find out who Elijah Brooks really was. Daniel had expected to discover that the boy's kindness was a performance. Maybe he wanted attention. Maybe he wanted sympathy. Instead, this was already the second time in less than 24 hours that he had watched Elijah quietly give away something he needed himself. Daniel frowned and typed notes into a tablet. The report was becoming more interesting by the minute. At school, things were less peaceful. The moment Elijah entered the hallway, he heard laughter. Tyler Dawson stood near a row of lockers surrounded by several students. The moment he spotted Elijah, a grin spread across his face. "There he is," Tyler announced. "The city's youngest charity worker." A few students laughed. One of them held up a phone. Elijah immediately recognized himself on the screen. It was the video from yesterday. Someone had uploaded the moment at the bench. The clip had already spread through the school. Look, Tyler continued dramatically. Maybe we should all start donating our lunches. Apparently, that is what heroes do. More laughter echoed through the corridor. Elijah tightened his grip on his backpack strap, but kept walking. He had learned long ago that arguing rarely changed minds. Behind him, the comments continued. Some students joined in. Others simply watched. A few looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. By lunchtime, nearly everyone had seen the video. Yet something unexpected happened. As Elijah sat alone near a window in the cafeteria, a freshman he barely knew approached his table. The boy set down a carton of milk. "I saw what you did," he said quietly. "My grandfather was homeless for a while after he came home from the military. Not many people helped him. I just wanted to say thank you." Before Elijah could respond, the student walked away. Elijah stared at the milk carton for a moment. Outside the cafeteria window, snow drifted slowly through the air. For the first time all day, the noise around him seemed a little less loud. But far above the city, inside the top-floor office of Whitmore Global Holdings, Richard Whitmore stood reading Daniel's latest report. The billionaire turned another page. Then another. With every line, his expression grew more thoughtful. Finally, he set the report down and looked out across the skyline. "Interesting," he murmured softly. "Very interesting." The next afternoon, the temperature dropped even further. Dark clouds rolled across the city, turning the sky a dull shade of steel. School had just ended when Elijah noticed the elderly veteran again. The man was standing outside a small convenience store near the bus stop, his shoulders hunched against the wind. What caught Elijah's attention was not the cold. It was the look on the man's face. He seemed confused, lost. Cars passed by in a steady stream, while people hurried along the sidewalk without slowing down. Elijah crossed the street. "Sir, are you okay?" he asked gently. The veteran blinked as though returning from a distant memory. "I think so," he said quietly. "I was trying to get to the shelter on Grand Avenue, but I took a wrong turn." Elijah glanced at the darkening sky. Snow had already started drifting down again. Grand Avenue was almost a mile away. The veteran looked exhausted. Elijah hesitated. His bus would arrive in less than 10 minutes. Missing it meant walking home through the storm. Yet the answer was already forming in his heart. "I can show you," he said. The older man looked surprised. "You do not have to do that, son." Elijah smiled. "I know." They started walking together. The wind pushed against them as they moved through the city streets. Snowflakes collected on Elijah's sleeves and backpack. Traffic lights reflected against wet pavement in streaks of red and gold. Halfway to the shelter, the veteran stumbled slightly. Elijah immediately slowed down. "Take your time," he said. The man nodded gratefully. Neither of them noticed a dark sedan several car lengths behind. Daniel Mercer sat inside, watching through the windshield. He had been instructed to observe, not interfere. Yet even he found himself shaking his head in disbelief. "The kid missed his bus," he muttered. Again. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Whitmore sat inside a conference room surrounded by executives discussing quarterly projections worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Charts glowed across a massive screen. Voices debated numbers and forecasts. Then Richard's phone vibrated once. A new message from Daniel appeared. Richard glanced down. Attached was a photograph. It showed Elijah walking beside the veteran through falling snow. The billionaire stared at the image longer than he intended. Around him, the meeting continued. Someone asked for his opinion. Richard barely heard the question. He looked back at the photograph. The boy's coat was too thin. His shoes were worn. Yet there he was, helping someone else again. Richard slowly set his phone on the table. "Gentlemen," he said, interrupting the discussion. The room fell silent. "Move tomorrow's board meeting to the afternoon." Several executives exchanged confused looks. "You have another appointment, sir?" one asked. Richard's gaze drifted briefly toward the window overlooking the city. "Yes," he replied. "Something more important just came up." Nearly an hour later, Elijah finally reached the shelter with the veteran. Warm light spilled from the entrance onto the snowy sidewalk. The man stopped before going inside. His eyes were bright with gratitude. "You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago," he said softly. Elijah smiled. "Someone good, I hope." The veteran chuckled. "One of the best men I ever met." For a moment, a strange expression crossed the older man's face, as though he wanted to say more. Instead, he simply placed a hand over his heart. "Thank you, son." Elijah nodded and turned toward the long walk home. Behind him, the shelter door closed. Ahead of him, snow continued falling beneath the glow of the streetlights. He had no idea that with every act of kindness, invisible threads were pulling his life toward a future he could not yet imagine. The walk home that evening felt longer than usual. Snow continued falling in thick, silent sheets, covering sidewalks, parked cars, and rooftops beneath a blanket of white. By the time Elijah reached his apartment building, his coat was damp and his hands felt numb despite being buried deep inside his pockets. He climbed the stairs slowly and pushed open the door to apartment 3B. Warm air greeted him, along with the familiar smell of soup simmering on the stove. Usually that smell made him smile. Tonight something felt different. The kitchen light was on, but his grandmother was not standing by the stove. Instead, Margaret Brooks sat quietly at the table, one hand resting against her chest as she stared at an unopened stack of envelopes. Elijah immediately noticed the worry in her eyes. "Grandma," he asked softly. She looked up and forced a smile. "You are home." Elijah pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "What happened?" For a moment she said nothing. Then she slid one of the envelopes across the table. It was a utility bill. Another was from a pharmacy. Another carried the logo of a medical clinic. Elijah's stomach tightened. He did not need to read the numbers to understand. Money was running out again. Margaret folded her hands together. "I was hoping to make it through the winter without worrying you." Elijah looked down at the envelopes. Outside the window, snow tapped gently against the glass. "We will figure it out," he said. She smiled sadly. "You always say that." Later that night, after dinner, Elijah sat alone beside the apartment window. The city lights shimmered through the snowfall. Down below, headlights drifted through the streets like slow-moving stars. He thought about the bills, about the rent, about the medicine his grandmother needed. He was only 12 years old, yet sometimes the weight of those thoughts felt far heavier than his backpack. The next morning, Elijah woke before sunrise and took on an extra newspaper route before school. The cold air burned his lungs as he pedaled an aging bicycle through slushy streets. Every dollar mattered. Every delivery mattered. By the time classes started, exhaustion tugged at his eyelids. Still, he pushed through the day without complaint. During lunch, Tyler Dawson spotted him carrying another stack of newspapers. "Look at that," Tyler called loudly. "The hero is working overtime now." Several students laughed. Elijah kept walking. "Maybe he is saving the whole city one newspaper at a time," another student joked. More laughter followed. Yet something had changed. A few students no longer joined in. Some looked away. Others seemed uncomfortable. The video that had once made Elijah the target of jokes was beginning to have an unexpected effect. People were starting to see the difference between kindness and mockery. That afternoon, while Elijah delivered newspapers after school, dark clouds gathered once again over the city. A freezing wind swept between the buildings. At one corner, he stopped beside a newspaper box and rubbed warmth into his hands. His fingers trembled from the cold. He had skipped buying himself a snack to save a few extra dollars for home. Across the street, a black luxury sedan remained parked quietly near the curb. Daniel Mercer lowered a pair of binoculars and shook his head. Every new report he sent to Richard Whitmore painted the same picture. The boy never asked for attention. He never complained. He simply kept choosing others before himself. Several miles away, Richard sat alone in his office reading the latest update. The billionaire leaned back in his chair and stared at a photograph showing Elijah delivering newspapers through the snow. The image remained on his desk long after sunset. Finally, Richard reached for his phone. "Daniel," he said when the call connected. "I have seen enough." A brief silence followed. "What would you like me to do?" Daniel asked. Richard's gaze settled on the photograph once more. His voice became thoughtful. "It is time for me to meet him." The following Saturday arrived wrapped in silence. Overnight snow had covered the city in a fresh layer of white, muting the usual noise of traffic and construction. Elijah sat beside the apartment window before sunrise, watching tiny flakes drift beneath the glow of the street lamp outside. The radiator clicked softly behind him. Somewhere in the kitchen, the coffee maker hummed. For a few precious minutes, the world felt still. He held a notebook on his lap, carefully reviewing his newspaper route schedule for the week ahead. Every extra dollar mattered now. The stack of bills on the kitchen table had not left his mind. Neither had the tired look in his grandmother's eyes. Margaret appeared in the doorway wearing a thick sweater and a gentle smile. "You are up early again." Elijah looked over his shoulder. Could not sleep. She walked over and rested a hand on his shoulder. Through the window, the first pale hints of morning light were beginning to touch the rooftops. "You worry too much for someone your age," she said softly. Elijah tried to smile. "Somebody has to." Margaret's expression softened even more. "No, baby. Somebody has to keep believing things will get better." For a moment, neither spoke. Snow continued falling beyond the glass. The city seemed suspended between night and day. Elijah looked down at his hands. They were rough from cold mornings and long deliveries. Yet what troubled him most was not the weather or the work. It was the feeling that he could never quite do enough. No matter how hard he tried, there was always another bill, another problem, another person who needed help. Later that morning, after finishing several newspaper deliveries, Elijah found himself sitting alone on a bench overlooking the frozen river that cut through downtown. The wind had calmed. Sunlight reflected across the ice in soft silver streaks. People passed by occasionally, bundled in winter coats and scarves, but no one paid much attention to the quiet boy staring across the water. Elijah pulled a small photograph from his wallet. It showed him and his grandmother several years earlier at a neighborhood fair. Both were smiling. The edges of the picture had become worn from being carried everywhere. He traced a finger along the image and exhaled slowly. "I am trying," he whispered to himself. The words disappeared into the cold air. Across town, Richard Whitmore stood inside his penthouse office looking at that same photograph displayed on a tablet screen. Daniel had included it in the latest report. Beside it were details about Elijah's school performance, his newspaper route, and his home situation. Richard barely glanced at the statistics. His attention remained fixed on the photograph. There was something in the boy's expression that reminded him of a version of himself he had not seen in decades. Before wealth, before boardrooms, before success had complicated everything. Richard walked toward the window overlooking the city. Snow-covered rooftops stretched to the horizon. Somewhere out there, Elijah was facing another difficult day without expecting anything in return. The billionaire stood quietly for a long moment. Then he picked up his coat from the chair beside his desk. This time he was not sending Daniel. This time he was going himself. Richard Whitmore found Elijah exactly where Daniel said he would be. The boy was standing outside a small neighborhood grocery store with a cardboard box balanced against his hip. The afternoon sun hung low behind the buildings, painting the snow-covered sidewalks in shades of gold and amber. People moved in and out of the store carrying bags and bundled packages, preparing for another cold night. Elijah stood near the entrance collecting canned food donations for a local shelter. Every few minutes someone dropped an item into the box. Many walked past without noticing him at all. Yet Elijah thanked every person the same way, with the same quiet sincerity. Richard remained across the street for several minutes, watching. He had spent decades negotiating billion-dollar deals. He had met presidents, celebrities, and world leaders. Yet for some reason, crossing this street felt strangely difficult. Finally, he stepped off the curb. Snow crunched beneath his polished shoes as he approached. Elijah noticed him immediately. "Good afternoon, sir," he said with a polite smile. "We are collecting donations for the Grant Avenue shelter." Richard looked at the nearly full box. "Are you volunteering?" Elijah nodded. "Yes, sir." "Why?" The question seemed to surprise him. Elijah thought for a moment. "Because they need help." Richard studied the boy's face. There was no performance, no expectation, just simple honesty. The billionaire glanced toward the grocery store entrance. "And what do you get out of it?" Elijah smiled slightly. "Nothing." The answer landed with unexpected force. Richard had spent most of his adult life surrounded by people who wanted something. Contracts, access, opportunities, favors. Yet this child stood in the cold, giving away his free time for people he barely knew. Before Richard could respond, a familiar voice echoed from nearby. "Of course he is doing charity work." Tyler Dawson approached with several friends trailing behind him. "That is basically his full-time job." A few chuckles followed. Elijah lowered his eyes briefly, but said nothing. Richard turned slowly toward the group. Tyler noticed the expensive coat, the luxury watch, and the unmistakable confidence of someone used to authority. His smile faded slightly. "And you are?" Richard asked calmly. Tyler straightened. "Tyler Dawson." "I see." The billionaire's voice remained polite. but something about it caused the boys to grow quieter. Richard looked back toward Elijah. "You know, I have been hearing quite a lot about you." Elijah blinked. "Me? Yes." Richard reached into his coat pocket and removed a business card. The gold lettering caught the afternoon light. He handed it to Elijah. The boy glanced down and froze. Even at 12 years old, he recognized the name. Everyone in the city knew Richard Whitmore. For a second, Elijah wondered if he was somehow holding the wrong card. Tyler leaned forward, trying to read it. The moment he saw the name, the color seemed to drain from his face. Around him, the laughter disappeared completely. Richard smiled gently. "I have been watching your actions for several weeks now." Elijah looked genuinely confused. "Why?" The billionaire's eyes shifted toward the donation box, then toward the snow-covered city beyond. "Because a long time ago," he said quietly, "someone showed me kindness when they had every reason not to. That kindness changed my life. And recently, I realized I had finally found the person who reminded me of that lesson." For the first time since they met, Elijah had no words. The winter air felt perfectly still. Even the street noise seemed distant. Richard Whitmore extended his hand. "Elijah Brooks, I would like to talk with you and your grandmother, if that is all right with you." That evening, Richard Whitmore's black sedan pulled up in front of apartment 3B just as the last traces of sunlight faded behind the city skyline. Elijah sat quietly in the passenger seat, still struggling to believe the events of the afternoon. Every few seconds he glanced at the business card resting in his hands, as if it might suddenly disappear. Richard noticed, but said nothing. Some moments needed time. When they climbed the narrow staircase and reached the apartment door, Margaret Brooks opened it before Elijah could knock. Concern flashed across her face when she saw the unfamiliar visitor standing beside her grandson. Then her eyes widened with recognition. "Mr. Whitmore?" she asked softly. Richard smiled. "Good evening, Mrs. Brooks. I hope I am not interrupting dinner." 20 minutes later, the three of them sat around the small kitchen table. The room felt almost surreal. Steam rose from cups of coffee while snow drifted outside the window. Richard listened as Margaret spoke about raising Elijah after her daughter's passing. He listened to stories about newspaper routes, school projects, and long winters spent stretching every dollar. He paid attention to every detail, not because he was being polite, because he genuinely wanted to know. Finally, Richard reached into a leather folder he had brought with him. He placed several documents carefully on the table. Margaret looked down at them, confused. "What is this?" Richard folded his hands. "The medical expenses from the clinic have been paid in full." Margaret stared at him. "Paid?" "Yes." She blinked several times. "All of them. Every last dollar." The room fell silent. Elijah looked from his grandmother to Richard and back again. Margaret's eyes filled with tears she immediately tried to hide. Richard continued gently. "The apartment lease has also been secured for the next 5 years. You will not have to worry about that either." Margaret covered her mouth. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak. Elijah sat frozen. He had spent countless nights worrying about bills he could not solve. Now those burdens seemed to be dissolving one by one. Yet what happened next surprised Richard. Elijah looked down at the documents and then slowly raised his head. "Sir?" Richard smiled. "Yes. Can I ask for something?" The billionaire nodded. "Of course." Elijah hesitated. "The shelter on Grant Avenue needs help too. And there are a lot of people like the veteran I met. If there is any way to help them too, I would really like that." The room became quiet again. Richard stared at the boy for several seconds. Most people would have asked for a larger apartment, new clothes, money, a better life. Elijah's first thought was someone else. Richard felt a tightness in his chest he had not experienced in years. Slowly, a smile spread across his face. "Actually," he said, "I was hoping you would say something like that." He opened the folder once more and revealed another document. This one outlined the creation of a new community outreach fund dedicated to supporting shelters, veterans, and struggling families throughout the city. At the top of the page was a name: the Elijah Brooks Community Initiative. Margaret lowered her eyes as tears rolled down her cheeks. Elijah simply stared at the paper, unable to speak. Outside, snow continued falling softly beneath the glow of the streetlights, while inside the small apartment, 3 generations of hope seemed to gather around a single kitchen table. Spring arrived slowly that year. The snow melted from the sidewalks. Trees that had stood bare for months began showing small green buds. The city felt lighter somehow, as if it had taken a long breath after winter. On a bright Monday morning, Elijah walked through the front doors of school carrying the same backpack he had always carried. The difference was not in what he wore. It was in how he carried himself. His shoulders seemed a little straighter. His smile came a little easier. As he moved through the hallway, students looked at him differently. The teasing had disappeared weeks earlier. In its place came nods, greetings, and quiet respect. Some students had volunteered at local shelters after hearing about the new community initiative. Others had begun organizing donation drives of their own. What surprised Elijah most was how quickly kindness could spread once people stopped being afraid of it. During lunch, he sat near the window where he often ate alone. This time, several students joined him. The conversation felt easy, normal. Across the cafeteria, Tyler Dawson glanced over briefly before lowering his eyes. The arrogance that once defined him had faded. In its place was something closer to humility. A few days earlier, he had quietly volunteered at the Grant Avenue shelter. He never announced it. He simply showed up. Sometimes lessons arrived in unexpected ways. Later that afternoon, Elijah visited the shelter after school. The building looked different now. Fresh paint covered the walls. New supplies filled the storage rooms. More families were receiving help. More veterans had warm places to stay. As Elijah stepped through the entrance, he immediately spotted the elderly veteran sitting comfortably near a window, reading a newspaper. The man looked healthier than before, stronger. When he saw Elijah, a smile spread across his face. "There is my favorite volunteer." Elijah laughed. "How are you feeling today?" "Better than I have in years." They talked for a while before Elijah continued helping distribute donated food. Outside, sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm rectangles of gold across the floor. Several miles away, Richard Whitmore stood beside the glass wall of his office overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Daniel Mercer entered carrying a folder. "The latest numbers are impressive," he said. "The initiative is already helping thousands of people." Richard nodded but did not immediately answer. His gaze drifted toward the streets below. Somewhere among those streets, a 12-year-old boy was still doing exactly what he had always done, helping people. Not because cameras were watching, not because recognition followed, simply because it was who he was. Richard smiled quietly. Success had taught him many lessons. Wealth had taught him others. Yet one of the most important lessons had come from a child standing in the cold beside a city bench. As evening settled over the city, Elijah finished his volunteer shift and began walking home. The sky glowed with shades of orange and blue. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining the sidewalk. Along the way, he noticed a man sitting alone on a bench. Without hesitation, Elijah reached into his backpack and pulled out an extra sandwich he had packed that morning. He handed it over with a warm smile. The man thanked him. Elijah nodded and continued walking. Behind him, the city lights slowly flickered on one by one. Ahead of him, the path home stretched beneath the fading sunset. The world around him had changed in ways he never imagined. Opportunities had appeared. Burdens had lifted. Lives had been transformed. Yet at his core, nothing had changed at all. Elijah Brooks remained exactly who he had always been. A boy who chose kindness when nobody expected it. And in the quiet beauty of that spring evening, that simple choice seemed more powerful than anything money could ever buy.